This is the second podcast of a series of linked podcasts that will take you through the planning stage for the essay question that you're looking at there. As I pointed out in the first podcast, you've really got to look at this question as consisting of two parts. And the first part, which we looked at in podcast 1, was the focus on Germany before 1914. So that's the bit that I've just highlighted there in blue. And as I say, Stephen Lee, S.J. Lee, chapter 6, the second essay, which I took you through in the first podcast, was really excellent on that. Okay, so the focus on what were the existing tensions that were there when the war broke out in 1914. The second part of the essay question, though, focuses in on the period 1914 to 1918. So it's actually the tensions during World War One. And of course, what you're being asked to do with this particular question is explore the links between those two separate parts of the question. So in the second podcast, we're going to focus in on the period 1914 to 1918. And what we're going to look at here, again, we're going to use Stephen Lee, and we're going to use an essay that he's written in his next chapter, which we'll move on to now, onto the next slide. So as you can see, this is from chapter 7. So you'll need to go to the articles folder, go to the subfolder called Lee, and then within that folder you will find this particular chapter, War and Collapse 1914 to 1918. As before, I'm not going to take you through point by point. You're well capable of reading this yourself. We've already done the background on this anyway, using Leighton, so this is just really to deepen your understanding. The beginning, you've got the background narrative. Okay, every Stephen Lee chapter begins simply with a descriptive account of what happened in the period. So that continues down to that point there. Now you've then got an essay, what were Germany's war aims and why were these not achieved? Now that isn't the focus for this particular podcast. It is not to say it's not relevant. In the previous lesson, a substantial element of one of the podcasts in the previous lesson was about Germany's war aims, which, as you know, divided Germany, particularly in the second half of the war. But I'll leave that for you to read and make notes on in due course. So as you can see, that goes on, and then the key, the Stephen Lee essay that's particularly relevant for the essay question that you're working on is this second one. What effect did the First World War have on Germany? Okay, so there shouldn't be anything in here that you can't cope with. Okay, just work your way through it. Again, I'll just give you a brief outline of some of the key features, but you need to work your way through it. Okay, so as you can see here, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. Okay, the first major paragraph focuses in on the Burgfriede. Okay, so that paragraph develops the whole notion of Burgfriede, the way in which there was overall all social groups pretty much united behind the war effort. Doesn't mean they united behind the war effort all for the same reason, but basically the war was greeted with enthusiasm in 1914, and that pretty much continued through into 1915 and to the early part of 1916, and it wasn't until 1916 that Burgfriede began to disintegrate. Lee even makes the point that even the extreme wing of the SPD that broke away greeted the war for the reason that they believed it would hasten revolution. Okay, although that was very distinctive from the majority of the SPD who supported the war effort because they felt it was a defensive war. So really make sure you pick up on the sort of division within the SPD. Okay, two distinct groups within the SPD. When you write your essay and you talk about the SPD's views, always distinguish between the majority SPD, who were in the centre left, and then the extreme SPD, or the independent SPD, that broke away on the extreme left. Okay, so as you can see, the majority of the population therefore believed Germany was involved in a just war. There's the bit about only the radical wing of the SPD opposed the war, but even here there was a strong feeling that war would serve the purpose of revolution by destabilising the regime. Lee then moves into the increasing mood turning against the war once they realised that it was going to become a prolonged war. Okay, so that turning point, 1916, and particularly moving into 1917 after the cold winter and the failure of the harvest in 1917. So all of those points we developed in the previous podcast. And he then talks about how by the middle of the war, by 1916, you're talking about total mobilisation for the war effort. Okay, there's that word, total mobilisation. And as Lee says, at first this was confined to the economic sector, the KRA, the Raw Materials Department, that section of the War Ministry. Okay, but of course, as we then have explored in the previous podcast, he then takes you through how it moved from just the economic sector to the political life of the nation, increasingly with the Bettmann-Hollweg being sidelined, and then he talks about his resignation and how the OHL effectively was the real ruling force of the army at that point there. So all this is very useful for consolidating your understanding of what you got from Leighton. So here he moves into political dictatorship. That was a sign that victory was not going to happen. Okay, the disillusionment of the various groups within the population. The elites found that war without swift victory brought internal dissension rather than external diversion. And so the whole idea of an escape forward, which was the purpose from their point of view of the war, was crumbling, and all the elites could now do was put complete faith in a swift victory, which for a brief period at the end of 1917-18, that those hopes were lifted, of course, with the surrender of Russia, but of course that was an illusion with America coming into the war. All of those points that we have already developed. So the essay continues on to page 112. So we talk about the gradual breaking of the consensus which had emerged in 1914, and by August 1918 the situation in Germany was desperate. Okay, so how do you use this for your essay question? Well, the real thing you need to look out for as you read through this particular essay is that Stephen Lee constantly makes references to change. Okay, what aspects of life before 1914 were continuing, what aspects were changing, and that's obviously the important thing that you need to do when you write your essay. Looking to the back of the chapter, again over here you've got sources, as I said in the previous podcast. Look for opportunities when you write your essay to weave in an occasional reference to a primary source, or just even a brief quote to support your point. That really does add substance to your answer. Okay, so just to recap, there are two Stephen Lee essays, one of them in chapter 6, the one we just looked at in chapter 7. Both of those essays are excellent for giving you material which you can use in the essay that you've got to hand in next week. Okay, so make sure you read those two chapters and pull out the points that you'd like to use in your essay. The next podcast will focus in on the introduction to that essay, and then the final podcast will give you some guidance about how to structure your answer. So move on to those two podcasts now. Hope that was useful to you, and I will sign off now. Thank you.